Hello everyone, and thank you for taking time to listen to my presentation today. My name is Nasri Salma, and today I will be presenting my MISI counseling dissertation titled Loneliness and Negative Effect in University Students. This research project explores the relationship between loneliness and emotional distress among university students, while also examining whether emotional regulation and self-efficacy help explain or reduce this emotional impact. I chose this topic because loneliness among university students has become an increasingly significant mental health concern, both clinically and academically. However, while there is a substantial research showing that loneliness is associated with depression, anxiety, and emotional distress, I found that much of the literature focuses primarily on direct relationships. What interested me more was the psychological process behind these relationships. I wanted to move beyond simply asking, does loneliness affect emotional well-being? Instead, I wanted to ask, why do some students experience loneliness as emotionally overwhelming while others appear more resilient despite similar experiences? This led me to explore two psychological mechanisms, emotion regulation and self-efficacy. Throughout this dissertation, I aimed to take a more process-oriented and psychological integrative approach, combining emotional, cognitive, and behavioral perspective in order to better understand student well-being. The student, therefore, are investigated the relationship between loneliness and negative effect, whether emotion regulation mediates this relationship, and whether self-efficacy moderates or buffers the emotional impact of loneliness. The background literature for this study demonstrates that loneliness is increasingly recognized as a major psychological and public health concern among university students. Importantly, loneliness is not simply the absence of relationships or physical isolation. The literature conceptualized loneliness as a subjective, cognitive, emotional experience of perceived disconnection. This distinction became central to my research because it highlights that loneliness is psychologically complex. A study may appear socially connected externally, yet internally still experience profound emotional isolation, feelings of rejection, inadequacy, or invisibility. The university environment itself can intensify vulnerability to loneliness because students are simultaneously managing major developmental transitions, academic pressure, identity formation, social comparison, financial stress, and separation from established support systems. When reviewing the literature, I found repeated evidence linking loneliness with emotional distress, depression, anxiety, and negative effects. However, I also noticed that many studies approach loneliness in a relatively linear way. For example, loneliness predicts depression or loneliness predicts anxiety. While these findings are valuable, they do not fully explain the psychological mechanisms involved. What particularly interested me was the cognitive and emotional dimension of loneliness. Research suggests that loneliness affects how individuals interpret social experiences. Lonely individuals might become more sensitive to social threat, more likely to expect rejection, and more likely to engage in negative self-evaluation. This creates a self-reinforcing style where loneliness increases emotional distress, and emotional distress then makes social connection more difficult. Therefore, became interested in understanding whether certain internal psychological resources might interrupt or weaken this cycle. One of the main gaps I identified within the literature was the limited exploration of mediating and moderating processes in the relationship between loneliness and emotional distress. Many existing studies establish that loneliness is harmful, but fewer studies examine how loneliness becomes emotionally distressing and what psychological mechanisms contribute to this process. Also, why some students appear more psychologically resilient than others. I therefore designed this study to move beyond descriptive correlations and instead investigate underlying psychological processes. The first variable I explored was emotion regulation. It refers to how individuals manage, process, and respond to emotional experiences. Theoretically, loneliness may interfere with emotion regulation because emotionally isolated individuals might struggle more with cognitive reappraisal, emotional processing, or adaptive coping strategies. Based on this framework, I hypothesized that loneliness would contribute to greater negative effect, partly through its relationship with emotion regulation difficulties. In statistical terms, emotion regulation was tested as a mediator. The second variable was self-efficacy, which refers to an individual's belief in their own ability to manage challenges and cope effectively in difficult situations. What interested me about it was its potential protective function. The literature suggests that individuals with a high self-efficacy may interpret stressors differently. Rather than viewing loneliness as overwhelming or permanent, they may perceive it as manageable or temporary. Therefore, I hypothesized that self-efficacy would weaken the relationship between loneliness and emotional distress. Statistically, self-efficacy was tested as a moderator. This process-oriented framework became one of the strongest aspects of the dissertation because it allowed the study to explore not only whether loneliness matters, but how psychological processes shape emotional outcome. One aspect of this dissertation that required considerable attention was methodological design and statistical justification. The study used a quantitative cross-sectional design involving 147 university students in the United Kingdom. Participants were recruited through Bangor University's SONA participant system, and data was collected using SciToolkit. Before data collection began, I conducted a priori power analysis using G-power in order to determine the minimum sample size required to detect a medium effect with sufficient statistical power. This analysis indicated that at least 138 participants were needed, meaning the final sample exceeded the required threshold. I placed significant emphasis on ensuring methodological rigor because I wanted the findings to be statistically meaningful and theoretically defensible. 4 standardized psychometric measures were used. Loneliness was measured using the U+ scale, which demonstrated excellent reliability between the current sample with Cronbach's alpha of 0.93. Negative effect was measured using the PANAS negative effect subscale, which also showed strong reliability with alpha of 0.88. Emotional regulation was measured using the emotional regulation questionnaire with acceptable reliability of 0.70. Self-efficacy was measured using the general self-efficacy scale with reliability of 0.84. Another important methodological decision involved assumption testing. During data screening, I identified violations of normality for some variables, including moderate skewness in loneliness and negative effect scores. Rather than ignoring these violations, I adapted the analysis accordingly and used Spearman's row correlations instead of parametric tests. This was important because it strengthened the validity of the findings and demonstrated responsiveness to the statistical properties of the data. To examine mediation and moderation effects, I used highest process macro. Process model 4 was used for mediation analysis and process model 1 was used for moderation analysis. I selected these models because they allowed for more sophisticated examination of indirect and interaction effect, moving beyond simple correlation analysis. Ethically, informed consent was obtained. Participation was voluntary, and anonymity and confidentiality were maintained throughout the research process. The results supported the first hypothesis and demonstrated a statistically significant positive relationship between loneliness and negative effect. The correlation coefficient was R equals 0.376 with a p-value below 0.001. This indicates that students who experienced higher loneliness also tended to report greater emotional distress. Importantly, the relationship was moderate rather than extremely strong. From an analytical perspective, this was significant because it suggested that loneliness contributes meaningfully to emotional distress, but additional psychological variables are also involved. The findings also demonstrated that loneliness was negatively associated with self-efficacy. In other words, students who felt lonelier tended to report lower belief in their ability to cope with challenges. Loneliness was also positively associated with difficulties in emotion regulation. These findings aligned with the theoretical framework developed earlier in the dissertation and suggested that loneliness interacts with broader emotional and cognitive processes. One aspect I found particularly interesting was that negative effect was not significantly correlated with emotion regulation at the zero-order level. This became important later when interpreting the mediation findings because it suggested that emotion regulation might not function as strongly as initially hypothesized. This demonstrates the importance of allowing the data to guide interpretation rather than forcing findings to fit theoretical expectations. The mediation and moderation analysis represented the most analytically complex section of the dissertation. First, emotion regulation was tested as a mediator between loneliness and negative effect. The results showed a statistically significant but weak indirect effect. This means that although loneliness was associated with emotion regulation difficulties, emotion regulation did not strongly explain the relationship between loneliness and emotional distress. Rather than overstating this finding, I interpreted it cautiously. One of the key strengths of the dissertation was acknowledging the limitations and complexity of the findings instead of simplifying them. The weak mediation might suggest several possibilities. First, emotional regulation itself is multidimensional and difficult to capture fully through self-report measures. The ERQ focuses mainly on cognitive reappraisal and expressive suppression, but emotional functioning in real life involves far more complex processes, including rumination, emotional awareness, avoidance, interpersonal regulation, and coping flexibility. Secondly, it may indicate that other psychological mechanisms, such as perceived social support or rumination, play a stronger explanatory role than emotional regulation alone. The moderation findings, however, were much stronger and theoretically meaningful. Self-efficacy significantly moderated the relationship between loneliness and negative effect. This means that the emotional impact of loneliness depends partially on students' level of self-efficacy. Students with high self-efficacy demonstrated a weaker relationship between loneliness and emotional distress. This finding strongly supports the idea that self-efficacy functions as a psychological buffer or protective factor. What made this finding particularly important was its practical relevance. Unlike some personality traits, self-efficacy is modifiable. It can potentially be strengthened through counseling, therapeutic intervention, resilience training, psychoeducation, and mastery experiences. Therefore, the findings are not only theoretically important, but also clinically applicable. One of the most important conclusions from this dissertation is that loneliness does not operate in a psychologically uniform way. Its emotional impact appears to depend partially on internal psychological resources. The findings suggest that self-efficacy may influence how students cognitively interpret loneliness. Students with stronger self-efficacy may perceive loneliness as temporary, manageable, or solvable. In contrast, students with lower self-efficacy may experience loneliness as evidence of inadequacy, rejection, and helplessness. This aligns with Bandura's social cognitive theory, which proposes that beliefs about coping influence emotional responses to adversity. The implications for counseling practice are significant. Many university interventions currently focus mainly on increasing social opportunities. However, this study suggests that social contract alone might not fully address emotional distress if students lack confidence in their ability to cope emotionally. This means interventions should not only aim to reduce loneliness externally, but also strengthen resilience internally. Potential interventions could include CBT-informed coping interventions, resilience training, mentoring programs, self-efficacy workshop, and emotionally focused psychoeducation. From a counseling perspective, this research reinforced the importance of exploring not only what clients experience, but how they psychologically interpret and respond to those experiences. The study also highlighted the complexity of student mental health and the importance of integrating emotional, cognitive, and behavioral frameworks when conceptualizing distress. Finally, the dissertation acknowledged several limitations, including the cross-sectional design, reliance on self-report measures, and limitations in generalizability due to the sample population. These limitations became important analytically because they allowed for a more balanced and critically reflective interpretation of the findings rather than an overly simplistic conclusion. To conclude, this dissertation found that loneliness was significantly associated with negative effects among university students. However, the study also demonstrated that psychological resources influence how emotionally impactful loneliness becomes. Emotion regulation showed only limited explanatory power, suggesting that emotional processes may be more complex than originally hypothesized. Self-efficacy emerged as the stronger protective factors, buffering the emotional impact of loneliness and reducing distress among students with greater confidence in their coping abilities. Overall, this research contributes to a more nuanced understanding of student mental health by demonstrating that loneliness is not simply a social issue, but also a cognitive and emotional process shaped by internal psychological mechanisms. Personally, this project also reinforced the importance of critically engaging with research rather than simply confirming theoretical expectations. One of the most valuable aspects of this dissertation process was learning how to interpret findings analytically, acknowledge limitations, honesty, and allow complexity to remain within the conclusion. Thank you very much for listening, and I can welcome any questions heading towards me.